You know that feeling, right? You walk into the grocery store, pick up your usual coffee, and suddenly it's like 50 cents more than last week. Or maybe your monthly grocery bill just jumps unexpectedly, even though you bought pretty much the same stuff. It's this subtle shift. You barely notice it day to day, but it's there, quietly eating away at what our money can actually buy. So today, we're taking a deep dive into something that touches every single one of us, every single day, often without us fully realizing, the mechanics behind it, inflation.
That's right. And at its most basic level, inflation just means a sustained rise in the general price level for goods, for services, over time. It's not just one or two things getting pricier. It's really about the overall purchasing power of your money, slowly, steadily decreasing. Think of it like this. You buy a candy bar for, say, $1 today. 6 months later, it's $1.20. That 20-cent jump, that's inflation right there, shrinking your dollar's real value.
So, okay, what does this all really mean for you? Our mission today is basically to unpack why it happens, why you absolutely should care about it, and how we even try to measure this kind of silent force. Get ready to understand what's truly happening when prices just keep on climbing.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dig into this a bit. Inflation isn't some random, act of economic nature. It doesn't just appear out of thin air. What are the core reasons prices start to rise in the first place?
Well, there are a few foundational causes that economists pretty consistently point to. One of the most classic is simply having too much money chasing too few goods.
Yeah.
It's that basic supply and demand imbalance.
Hmm.
Imagine a situation where everyone suddenly gets a load of extra cash, but the shops don't magically have more stuff on the shelves.
Mhm.
Prices will naturally get bid up, right? Because demand is just way higher than supply.
Right, makes sense.
Then you've got production bottlenecks. These are basically problems in getting goods actually made or transported. Maybe a key factory shuts down, or there's a huge shipping crisis like we've seen sometimes, slowing down global trade. That directly hits the availability of goods.
Okay.
We also often deal with increases in import costs. So if the raw materials or finished goods we buy from other countries get pricier, could be currency changes, could be uh, geopolitical stuff, those higher costs inevitably trickle down to us, the consumers. And finally, sometimes it's actually a result, direct or indirect, of policy choices. Decisions by governments or central banks, if they're not managed carefully, can inadvertently fuel price hikes. Like in the past, you've seen governments print way too much money to pay off debts that just floods the economy with cash and makes each dollar or whatever currency worth less.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, these broad reasons for rising prices, they often show up in two main ways that we see playing out in the economy.
And understanding these two main drivers, these sort of characters of inflation, that really helps make sense of the news headlines and even our own bills, right? Let's start with what's called cost push inflation. Sometimes you hear it called supply shock inflation. This one seems really key for understanding why your grocery bill suddenly looks different.
Precisely, yeah.
Hmm.
Cost push happens when the cost of the inputs needed to produce goods and services gets more expensive. So when raw materials, labor, energy, transport costs, when those go up, producers often don't have much choice. They have to pass those higher costs onto us, the consumers, through higher prices for the final products.
Right.
Think about global crude oil prices suddenly shooting up, or maybe widespread labor shortages driving up wages, or even a natural disaster wiping out a major crop.
Yeah.
This can make everything from, the bread for your sandwiches to the car you drive much pricier. It starts with the producers trying to keep their profit margins, but it ends up hitting our pockets directly.
So if I'm hearing you right, cost push is almost like a bottom-up pressure coming from the producer's costs. Like the price of lumber goes up, so new houses get more expensive. That makes intuitive sense. Okay, now let's flip that coin and talk about demand pull inflation. This feels like a very different animal.
It absolutely is, yeah.
Yeah.
A different force entirely. Demand pull happens when people collectively have more money to spend or just a really strong desire to spend it. But the supply of goods hasn't caught up. It's limited. So when overall demand outstrips the available supply, sellers find they can comfortably raise prices. Why? Because they know people are willing and able to pay more.
Ah, okay.
Imagine like a whole city where everyone suddenly gets a significant bonus at work.
Yeah.
You've got thousands of people with extra cash. Maybe they all decide they want new cars or they want to renovate their homes. If there aren't enough cars on the lots or enough contractors available, prices naturally climb just because of that surge in demand. It's that classic supply and demand principle, just playing out on a huge economy-wide scale.
Ah, I guess that explains why my favorite artisanal coffee jumped 50 cents last month. Maybe everyone in my neighborhood suddenly decided they needed one. So ultimately, understanding these two forces, cost push and demand pull, it really helps you kind of dissect the news, right? Is the price hike in your groceries because of a supply chain issue cost push? Or is it because everyone suddenly has more cash burning a hole in their pocket demand pull? That distinction feels pretty crucial for getting a handle on economic trends.
So, okay, we've talked about prices rising steadily, sort of predictably. But what happens when it goes completely off the rails? When inflation just loses all sense of control and rockets upward? We're talking about hyperinflation.
Yeah, this is inflation basically gone wild. Prices rise so incredibly fast that money itself starts to lose its meaning almost hour by hour. Picture a carton of milk costing, say, 50 units of currency today, then 100 tomorrow, and potentially 500 by next week. It's just an economic nightmare. Destroys stability.
The most famous historical example, the one everyone points to, is the German hyperinflation back in the 1920s. After World War I, the German government was facing enormous reparations payments, huge economic stress, and they basically started printing currency at an absolutely astounding rate to try and pay debts, hoping it would somehow stimulate the economy.
And the result?
Astonishing, and frankly, tragic. Bread could literally cost billions of marks.
Ilk.
Billions. People were actually using bundles of banknotes to light their stoves because the currency itself was cheaper than buying kindling wood.
Unbelievable.
Entire life savings were just completely wiped out overnight. The value of money vanished so quickly it became impossible for people to live normally, to save, to plan for anything. It really fractured society and left these incredibly deep scars.
That really puts it into perspective, doesn't it? Why understanding this isn't just some, academic exercise. It's actually quite chilling to think about money losing its value that fast. It really underscores why central banks are so focused on guarding against that kind of scenario, because it has real devastating human consequences. So given all of that, why does this really matter to you right now, today? What's the direct impact on your daily life, your wallet, your future plans?
Oh, it matters deeply because inflation silently eats away at your money's actual value.
Yeah.
It's like this hidden tax on your purchasing power. $100 or pounds or euros today simply won't buy the same amount of stuff next year.
Right.
And this hurts different groups in very direct ways. People on fixed incomes, think retirees living on pensions, or maybe people with fixed salaries that don't adjust quickly.
Yeah.
They get hit incredibly hard because their income stays the same, but their living costs just keep going up. Their purchasing power just dwindles month after month.
Yeah, that's tough.
Businesses, too, they face massive uncertainty. It makes planning for investments, setting prices, really difficult. And that impacts job creation, economic growth. And if you're trying to save money or invest, inflation can erode your real returns. That means your savings might actually shrink in terms of what they can buy over time, even if the number in your account looks bigger.
And this brings us to a really fascinating, almost psychological concept called money illusion. It's like a trick our brains play on us when we think about our finances, isn't it?
It genuinely is.
Yeah.
We often feel richer when we see our income go up, or just when we have more cash in our hands. Feels good. But, and this is the crucial bit, if prices rise even faster than that income increase, we're actually poorer in terms of what our money can truly buy.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's make it concrete. Imagine you get a salary increase from, say, 10,000 units of currency to 11,000. Sounds great, right? 1,000 more units.
Yeah, feels like a win.
But what if your rent, your food, your travel costs, all those essentials, go up by 1,500 units during that exact same period? Your net gain in actual purchasing power is negative 500 units. You're actually worse off, even though you have more money in your bank account.
Wow, okay.
That's money illusion in action.
Yeah.
And it can be really deceptive, and it makes us feel financially okay, maybe even good, when we're quietly losing ground.
So sometimes inflation isn't just an economic accident floating around. It can actually be, at least partly, a consequence of specific policy choices. Governments might deliberately want to boost economic growth, maybe coming out of a recession, so they make certain decisions. But those choices can have, side effects.
That's spot on.
Yeah.
To stimulate the economy, governments and central banks might use policies like lowering interest rates. That makes borrowing cheaper for both consumers and businesses, the idea being to encourage spending and investment. They might also push for more government spending, infrastructure projects, social programs, directly injecting money into the economy. Or they might cut taxes, leaving more money in people's pockets, hoping they'll spend it.
But there's a catch.
There's always a catch. The challenge is, if these actions aren't carefully balanced, and if the supply side of the economy can't keep up with that increased demand, inflation can definitely shoot up as a direct result. It's a really delicate balancing act.
Which brings us to a really interesting point. How much control do governments and central banks actually have over these huge forces? And what are the potential downsides of, say, lowering interest rates too much or spending a bit too freely?
Well, it's a constant tightrope walk. The downside is exactly what we're discussing, inflation. If you pump too much money into the system, either through cheap borrowing or direct spending, and there aren't enough goods and services to soak it up, prices escalate. That's the risk. Historically, we've definitely seen instances where governments, maybe trying too hard to stimulate growth or trying to pay off massive debts, have injected way too much liquidity, and that leads to significant inflationary problems down the line. It's like trying to make a car go faster by just pouring more gas in without considering if the engine can actually handle it.
Okay, so given all these complex factors, all these moving parts, how do we even know what the inflation rate is? How do we track this silent eater of wealth to really understand its impact day to day or month to month?
Right. Well, to track inflation, economists and governments rely on various indices. The most common one you'll hear about is the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. The CPI essentially tracks what typical households spend their money on. They do this by creating a sort of hypothetical basket of goods and services.
A shopping basket.
Exactly, a representative shopping basket. And it's incredibly diverse. It includes everything from, food staples and fuel to housing costs, rent, transport fares, education fees, even healthcare costs. Each item in this basket has a specific weight, reflecting how much of a typical household's budget is usually spent on it. By tracking the price changes of this consistent basket over time, month after month, year after year, we get a pretty reliable, albeit generalized, measure of overall inflation.
Okay, CPI. But then you also hear terms like headline and core inflation. What's the difference there?
Good question. So within the CPI framework, there's an important distinction. Headline inflation is the full CPI number. It includes everything in that basket we just talked about, even those items whose prices can jump around a lot, like fresh vegetables depending on the harvest, or gasoline prices reacting to global events. So headline gives you the overall immediate picture, but it can be a bit noisy, spiking up or down suddenly because of those volatile items. Core inflation, on the other hand, is the CPI minus those volatile components specifically. It usually excludes food and energy prices. Because those can swing so wildly due to temporary factors, stripping them out gives what's considered a more stable measure. It helps economists track the sort of longer-term underlying inflation trend. It smooths out those big, quick jumps and gives a clearer signal of the more persistent price pressures in the economy.
Okay, that makes sense. Headline is everything. Core smooths out the big bumps. So if inflation is becoming a problem, if that CPI number is climbing too fast, what concrete actions can governments and central banks actually take to bring it back under control? Is there some kind of magic bullet, a switch they can flip to just make prices stop rising without causing other problems?
Huh, if only. Unfortunately, there's no magic bullet, and there are almost always trade-offs involved. Any action has potential side effects. But generally, there are two main policy approaches they can take. One approach is to focus on the supply side, trying to ease those supply constraints we talked about earlier. This could mean things like investing in infrastructure to improve logistics and transportation networks, making it easier to get goods to market, or policies to support farming to increase food production, or maybe making it easier to import essential goods quickly if there's a domestic shortage. The goal here is basically to increase the overall availability of goods and services, which naturally helps to relieve upward pressure on prices.
Okay, fix the supply problems. What's the other side?
The other side is to try and restrict that demand pull inflation, to cool down overall demand in the economy. This often involves the central bank raising interest rates. Higher interest rates make borrowing more expensive for both consumers and businesses. That tends to discourage spending, discourage big investments, and effectively cools down demand.
Right, the brakes.
Exactly. Governments can also play a role by reducing their own spending, or even in some cases increasing taxes to pull money out of the economy. Again, the aim is to reduce the overall demand that's bidding up prices. But it's that constant balancing act we mentioned. If they hit the brakes too hard with interest rate hikes, they risk slowing down the economy too much, maybe even causing a recession. If they're too lenient, inflation could spiral. It's all about calculated risks and trying to find that sweet spot.
That's a fascinating look at the modern toolkit, but what truly surprised me when we were looking into this was learning that some of the earliest sort of foundational principles of inflation control were actually championed by someone you'd least expect. We're talking about Isaac Newton. Seriously, the gravity and calculus guy, how on earth does he fit into inflation?
That sounds unlikely, right?
Huh?
But you'd be surprised how these things connect. Newton, the absolute genius behind the laws of motion and universal gravitation, also served as the warden and later the master of the Royal Mint in England
Hmm.
for many years. And in his time, a really big problem was rampant coin creasing. People would literally shave off tiny bits of the precious metal silver or gold from the edges of coins before passing them on. And there was also outright counterfeiting, making fake coins.
Messing with the money itself.
Exactly. This not only debased the currency, meaning the coins contained less valuable metal than they were supposed to, but it also completely messed with the money supply. It created an environment where the actual value of any given coin was uncertain. People couldn't trust the money, and this uncertainty, this lack of trust in the currency, in essence, contributed to rising prices for actual goods and services. If you don't trust the coin, you demand more of them for your product.
So Newton stepped in.
He did. With his characteristic, rigorous scientific mind, Newton cracked down hard on counterfeiters and clippers. He pursued them relentlessly, apparently even going undercover sometimes to gather evidence. And he implemented really strict measures to standardize the coinage. He focused on ensuring each coin contained its proper, stated amount of precious metal. Quality control, essentially. By controlling the currency supply, by meticulously maintaining its integrity and its inherent value, he was, in essence, practicing basic inflation control. He was working to ensure that a coin actually meant something, that it represented a stable amount of purchasing power.
Wow.
It just goes to show that the fundamental principles of managing the value of money, of controlling things that erode that value, like debasement or, sort of earthen forms of inflation, they've been around for a very, very long time, long before we had formal economic theories with fancy names.
That's incredible. Fundamental principles just transcending centuries. Okay, so we've covered the big picture, the main types, the history, even Newton. But let's zoom back in a bit on some of the maybe less obvious forces at play that can also drive inflation. And crucially, who truly bears the brunt when prices climb relentlessly?
Yeah, absolutely. There are several other key drivers we should touch on, beyond the big two. One is currency depreciation. If your country's currency loses value compared to other currencies, imports automatically become more expensive because you need more of your currency to buy the foreign one. This feeds directly into higher prices domestically for pretty much anything imported, from electronics to coffee beans.
Okay, what else?
Another factor can be when wages rise significantly faster than productivity. Now, rising wages are generally good, but if workers are getting paid much more without a corresponding increase in how much they're producing, firms might raise their prices to cover those higher labor costs and maintain their profit margins, effectively pushing those costs onto consumers.
Right, passing the buck.
And finally, sometimes governments implement what are called administered price hikes. This is where the government directly increases prices on things it controls or heavily regulates. Think about things like fuel prices, public transport fares, or maybe utility costs like electricity or water. Those decisions can directly add to inflation.
So, given all these potential drivers, who really feels the pinch the most when inflation takes hold?
Well, sadly, it's often the most vulnerable segments of society. The poor, for instance. They spend a much, much larger percentage of their income on absolute essentials, food, housing, energy, basic transport. So when those prices go up, it hits their budgets disproportionately hard. There's less room to cut back.
Makes sense.
The salaried middle class often feels it too. They might face delayed salary increases or raises that just don't keep pace with the rising cost of living. So their real wages, what their salary can actually buy, might shrink over time, even if the nominal number on their pay slips stays the same or goes up slightly.
Yeah, the money illusion again.
Exactly. And businesses, as we mentioned, struggle. Uncertainty makes it hard to plan, to invest, to hire. It creates friction in the economy. And even the government itself faces pressure. Think about subsidy programs for food or fuel or welfare spending. The costs of providing these services rise dramatically, putting strain on public finances.
And then there's this nightmare scenario you sometimes hear economists whisper about: high inflation and low economic growth happening at the same time. That's stagflation, right?
That's the one, stagflation. It's truly the worst combination imaginable for policymakers and for the public. You have high, persistent inflation eating away at purchasing power, plus a stagnating economy with slow growth, maybe even rising unemployment. So no jobs and high prices. It's incredibly difficult to fix because the usual medicine for inflation, like raising interest rates, can hurt growth even more.
Vicious cycle.
Exactly. And the usual cure for slow growth, like cutting rates or increasing spending, can fuel inflation further. It presents this horrible policy dilemma with incredibly difficult trade-offs. Painful choices have to be made.
It sounds awful.
It is. And partly because of these challenges and the desire for stability, many central banks around the world, like the Bank of England, the Fed in the US, the RBI in India, they now practice what's called inflation targeting. They publicly announce a specific target level for inflation, often around 2% or maybe like 4% in some developing economies, usually with a small band or margin around it. The idea is to anchor expectations. Too low inflation, like deflation, can be bad, signaling a weak economy where people delay spending. But too high, as we've seen, leads to chaos. So they aim for this moderate, predictable level of inflation. It's generally considered healthy because it allows for gradual wage and price adjustments without causing major instability.
Okay, aiming for that sweet spot. So bringing it right back to the listener's pocket. What does all this mean for your savings? Let's talk again about that crucial concept, real versus nominal interest rates, because what you see advertised isn't always what you actually get in terms of spending power.
This is absolutely critical for anyone saving or investing. The nominal interest rate is simply the rate you see stated. Like your bank offers a 6% fixed deposit. That's the nominal rate. It's the number before you account for inflation. The real interest rate, however, is what you actually earn after adjusting for the impact of inflation.
How does that calculation work, roughly?
Roughly, you subtract the inflation rate from the nominal interest rate. So if your nominal fixed deposit pays 6%, but the inflation rate over that same period is 7%, your real return is actually minus 1%. 6%, 7% against 1%.
So you're losing money in real terms.
Precisely. In terms of purchasing power, you're actually losing ground. Even though the number of pounds or dollars in your account might be going up slightly, your money can buy less next year than it can today, despite earning that nominal interest. It's a really critical distinction for understanding whether your savings are truly growing or just treading water or even shrinking.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. And finally, just to broaden the view one last time, let's not forget that inflation isn't just a purely local domestic phenomenon, is it? What happens across borders, often thousands of miles away, can quickly find its way into your daily budget here.
That's profoundly true, especially in today's interconnected global economy. Global events can have huge ripple effects. Think about sudden oil price surges because of geopolitical tensions in the Middle East. That affects energy costs everywhere. Widespread conflicts or wars, like the one in Ukraine, disrupt crucial supply chains for things like grain and fertilizer, pushing up food prices globally. Or even large-scale climate disasters, droughts, floods impacting agricultural production in major food exporting regions. That reduces global supply and pushes prices up for everyone. This interconnectedness means that a shock in one part of the world can very quickly translate into higher prices for goods and services right in your own country, whether it's through increased import costs, shipping delays, or just reduced global supply of key commodities. We're all linked.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, it's really crystal clear that inflation isn't just some abstract economic term buried in textbooks or financial reports. It touches every single part of our daily lives, from the cost of your groceries and your daily commute to the real value of your savings, your salary negotiations, and even your long-term future planning, like saving for a house or retirement.
Absolutely. And understanding inflation isn't really about memorizing jargon or complex economic formulas. It's more about developing the ability to see through the price tags, the salary slips, the monthly budgets. It's about realizing that the numbers you see don't always tell the full story of your money's true value, its actual purchasing power. Because, at the end of the day, what truly matters is this fundamental question. Can your money tomorrow buy the same things it does today? Or less?
So, the next time you see a price jump on something you buy regularly, don't just sigh in frustration, though that's understandable. Maybe pause for a second and consider, is this a cost push? Maybe driven by some global supply issue or higher energy costs? Is it a demand pull, maybe because the economy is running hot and everyone suddenly wants the same thing? Or perhaps, just perhaps, is it a tiny whisper of history? Maybe even a faint echo of Isaac Newton's meticulous work at the Royal Mint, still influencing the very value and integrity of our coins and currency centuries later. Definitely something to think about. Go ahead and continue your own deep dives.